Last summer, New Yorkers learned the tragic story of Andy Henriquez of Washington Heights. Andy was 16 when he was sent to the Rikers Island jail complex for his alleged involvement in a gang-related killing. He was still there 3 years later, awaiting trial, when he was found dead in a solitary confinement cell. That was in 2013. The tragic circumstances surrounding his death only became public following a scathing report released in August about the abysmal conditions for young people jailed at Rikers. But the real question is whether he belonged at Rikers in the first place. More than 600,000 young people cycle in and out of such facilities every year. Many of them are first-time offenders whose chances of a better future are effectively destroyed once they land in the juvenile justice system. Some state and county authorities are already adopting alternative approaches that avoid detention. Are these approaches suitable? And can we prevent troubled young people from being caught up in the system at all? These aren't easy questions. Our two guests on Criminal Justice Matters today have dedicated their careers to looking for answers. Tracy Kesey studies relations between police and youth at the Center for Policing Equity at UCLA, which she helped found. She lives in Denver, where she spent 26 years in law enforcement. Dr. John Deasy is the former superintendent of the Los Angeles Unified School Board, the nation's second largest school system with more than 600,000 students. So great to have both of you here. Tracy, let me start with you. We've gone through a lot in juvenile justice over the last 5 years. Things have marginally gotten better. There are fewer juveniles in prison these days, but there's still a lot more to be done, as I'm sure you'd agree. So, I mean, is one of the problems that we've over-criminalized juvenile behavior today, whereas 10 years ago, 15 years ago, what hijinks that kids would get up to and not land them in jail or before the courts?
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at what's going on in the schools, and for most, I would say, cities, you have police officers in the schools. We take a look at, specifically in urban schools, what they are ticketing kids for. When I was growing up, you used to pinch somebody. It was kind of a sign that you might like that person, and now it's an assault. And so we're definitely over-criminalizing what we call kid behavior, things that we used to do. I mean, we all fought. We all rolled around on that playground, but it did not rise to the level where you had a ticket or you were sent to jail over it. So we definitely are over-criminalizing things.
What's driving it? Is it fear? Is it violence? Are we running into things that we haven't run into before? Mm-hmm.
It's a combination of all those things. And when I look at it post-Columbine. We definitely made a swing to try to tamp down on all behavior that we believe may indicate something larger looming among kids. And so once we took that swing, we never really went back to kind of check ourselves and to make sure that, what we were doing had the appropriate effect we were trying to do post-Columbine. So, every little thing that happens, whether it is, I think an example that was given to me, when you have kids coming to school in Halloween costumes and he has a hook, hand for Captain Hook, and all of a sudden he's sitting in the principal's office for bringing a weapon. So we really need to step back and take a look at what a lot of these initiatives have done, not only to the kids, but specifically to kids of color. That's typically what's happening in the urban schools. So there's definitely some room to review what's been going on.
Talk a bit about that. Why is it happening? Is it because of the police? You were a 26-year veteran of the police force. Is it attitudes on the part of the police? Is it fear? Is it self-protectiveness in the majority of society, or what?
Well, I mean, there's multiple things going on. First of all, parents want their children to be safe when they're in school. I think the teachers want the same thing, and we want our teachers to be safe. But, when you're using police to enforce policy that historically was enforced by principals, by the classroom teacher, and you criminalize that behavior, those things transfer. I mean, you certainly will have teachers articulating in different ways that they're afraid of their students. To me, that's a larger issue, as opposed to the criminal behavior. And a lot of times, is there crime in school? Yeah, there are. But most of what we're seeing with kids today are those things that we used to do when we were kids.
Dr. Deasy, you're on the front lines in LA Unified School District. Are teachers afraid of kids in LA, and should they be?
So, first I was going to say I agree with many things that my colleagues said, but I would want to say that we're moving far too slow. So the question is, are we seeing good things? Not nearly enough yet. I think that there are adults who are afraid of youth. And I think there are adults who are afraid of youth before youth would actually even display something that would give you pause or reason to be concerned. I think that I completely agree that we've begun a deliberate and wholesale process of criminalization of juvenile behavior. I mean, back when we were growing up, there was juvenile delinquent. There's a gulf between what delinquent behavior is and what juvenile behavior is. And we have put them together, and we have outright criminalized that in schools. I think it's tough. There are many, many reasons. But I think that if we want to have a quite honest and frank conversation, issues of race and class and the ability to have a level of comfort, even with language or discourse around that, plays in almost all of these cases. I mean, no one looks like me in LAUSD. I have the privilege of working with 900,000 amazing students.
Second largest school system in America.
Correct. But there are wholesale issues. I mean, language issues and the predispositions that come with where students come from. Most students are not, they're first generation or current, not documented. And that comes with a whole baggage of kind of assumptions around behavior. And then I think the system went to zero tolerance overnight, which was zero common sense. And we have been trying to work our way back from that. And I think that while we've done stuff and work in LA that's truly appropriate, I wouldn't even want to say it's groundbreaking because we absolutely should be doing this. We've just done it quickly and at scale. And these issues that make people uncomfortable when you are trying to decriminalize common youth behavior in schools and not ticket students for things that they should be going through assistant principal.
New York City is now talking about changing its code of discipline for schools.
Good.
Now, you have been there. I mean, that's exactly what you've been doing in LA.
Right.
Tell us a little bit about that. How's that worked out?
So we approached this in kind of three ways. One way was outright decriminalization. So do we have police in school officers sworn? Absolutely. And they have an incredibly important role to play. Most of our schools are proximate to places of violence and crime. And one of their major roles is to prevent people from getting into this campus. These are large urban cities with multiple large urban problems. So I'm a dad, everybody wants their child safe in school. There are, on occasion, criminal behavior in school. Police need to be there to take care of that. By and large, police do not need to be dealing with truancy, tardy, possession of a cigarette, failure to comply with directives in school. I mean, these are issues about which we have an administration. And so we've gone from just outright stopping the ticketing, which is giving you a summons where you end up in court and then in the pipeline and go to jail, for low-level inappropriate conduct. You're going to sell drugs on campus, you're going to eventually have to meet an officer, and you're going to have to, if you're going to bring a weapon on campus, that's the case. If you are repeatedly not going to class on time, you do not belong in front of a county judge around those issues. Second of all is we passed the Climate Bill of Rights for students. So the Student Climate Bill of Rights set forth what we believe was, and students helped us do this and so did our community advocates, a series of rights that students had that we made explicit and how the system will actually support those. And those are about working with, we use the term reentry. These are youth coming out of detention, out of prison, coming back to school, who have every right to come back to school and have every right to have the courses that you and I would want in school, and a system of how to do that, and a system about how to intervene so students are not getting themselves into the pipeline, whether at home in their neighborhood or actually on the
So how do you,
schoolyard.
where do you draw the line? So the police are not in the schools anymore. Are they
Yes,
outside?
Yes,
They
No,
are
they're
in the
absolutely
schools.
in the schools. There's no
Uniform.
question about that.
Uniform
Uniform police, that's correct. And they need to be. I mean, we have, unfortunately, schools are on lockdown frequently. There are banks robbed, there are people shot, there are suspects being chased, and sometimes those things enter school. And we want to make sure kids are safe for that. Very different than you're not going to class on time. But at one point, we kind of treated all of that the same. And then the third thing was just the complete work we did around suspensions and the dramatic dropping of suspensions in schools and the absolute stopping of criminalizing behavior that was not criminal whatsoever. And there's no question that when I began in the administration, now we're a large system, so the numbers just get that, 48,000 suspensions a year. And the overwhelming majority were youth of color, but particularly young black men. They were 9 times likely to be a suspension for willful defiance, and they're 1/9 of the population. So the disproportionality was stunningly problematic. We've simply said we're not going to allow willful defiance as a reason to be suspended, and changed our own discipline code. And unto that itself, we last year saw just under 8,000 suspensions. So we went from 48,000 to 8,000.
So in the time that the program has been working in LA, have there been any measurable results in terms of student test scores?
I would say yes, and not just test scores. And as a mathematician by trait, I will use the word stunning. So when you take graduation rates from 58% to 77%, and that is in many ways about improving teaching and helping people have the materials they need in classrooms and all of the things on the educational side of the house. And I don't teach anymore, and so I can take zero credit for how well students do in a classroom. These are the amazing men and women who do that. But the reality is, if we push them out, they can't possibly graduate. So a whole chunk of the improvement is we're keeping you. I remember vividly going to LA for the first time and people saying, oh, this huge, huge dropout problem. What I discovered was, no, there was a big push-out problem. And actually wanting to do something about that and saying there's a way to work with you without saying goodbye to you. That is a large part of why we're watching dramatic rises in graduation rates and achievement rates. It shouldn't be shocking that student achievement went up.
Yeah.
We were not pushing you out anymore. We're actually keeping you. Now, you had to go, and there are consequences to leave school when you are doing something that is gravely problematic. And there's the Big Five in California, and those things. If you're going to bring a weapon, you're going to use a weapon, sell drugs, do drugs, strike a person, an adult, you're going to have a problem.
But was there pushback? I mean, I wonder from police, and teachers, they say, well, look,
Yes, it's pushback.
Is that an understatement?
It's an understatement because we're trying to bring a system to some balance where we had, I believe, and I think in the country we've lost our balance on this issue. So I use this word zero tolerance because I think everybody can understand what that means. And that is the zero common sense piece. A fourth grader with a Halloween costume, just, put the Captain Hook thing away.
Yeah.
Not call a police officer for, a 9-year-old.
Tracy, is there any reason why police would object to that?
No, you wouldn't. And I think what you've served to do is you redefined, or I should say you went back old school with us on what our true relationships were supposed to be.
Right.
And that is, of the Big Five that you have, that's very appropriate in calling the police when those things are happening. But also the ability to build relationships with young folks in those schools in an appropriate manner, not one of fear and not one of intimidation where you think if I walk up to Officer Kazee, she's just going to put me in jail. There would be pushback because when you think about the number of calls for service that a school that's that large would have, especially if they're in lockdown for outside reasons, but if the teacher believes that something is going on or they're fearful, then if you didn't have the officers in school, they would be going there anyway. They'd be responding. So by having them there, it does serve a purpose. So I can see there being a little bit of pushback on some of that, saying, well, you've changed our role. But for those of us who've been around a long time, that was our original role. Our original role was to be that of part of the community and a part of rendering safety when needed, not to enforce the law when...
I really want to pick up on this piece because I'm actually incredibly proud of the women and men who serve in LAUSD, Los Angeles School District. We implemented this entire process called restorative justice, and police actually were trained in that, and that is everything from safe passage home through multiple kind of gang crossing to get to your house, to how actually to work with police outside. These are LAUSD police, not the LAPD, to outright just mentoring and guidance. So building a healthy relationship with law enforcement has
Does
been
that actually happen, though?
Yeah,
I mean,
it
we
has.
say it should happen, but it doesn't happen.
It very much has, but it's been a very rapid push to get there. This is not something that was there 5 and 8 years ago. And I just want to say, while I think there's a variety of, quote, pushback on this. One is, so we're just going to let kids get away with anything. Well, there is consequence. We didn't say we'd have zero consequence.
Right.
We said we would just modify zero tolerance. There is always a consequence. That's why you're actually in school. Failure to pick a piece of paper up after being told 3 times by the teacher is actually not a felony. Okay? It's juvenile behavior. It's why you go to school, to learn self-control and to work in society. When we criminalize it, we own part of the pipeline for which we then have to ask her to come into school.
Right.
We want you, unfortunately, to come when we have a problem we can't solve.
Right, right. But I think too that, although the officers inside your school might not be part of the larger police community, there's a spillover positive effect to that though, right? So once the kids go outside, they may interact with someone and have a negative interaction. So to me, the benefit of that is saying, I know that everybody doesn't act this way. And I know that there are folks that I can interact with in law enforcement that do a good job and worry about my well-being and care about me.
So I want to get to that a bit. So a teenager spends maybe 80% of his life in school before he goes on to college or whatever he does. The other 20% is still crucial. What he does outside, at home, with his friends on the streets. How do you make that piece of his life work so that it doesn't spill over into school, so that he avoids that jump that gets him involved with the criminal justice system as an adult?
Well, to me, it's a holistic approach, and it's what we would call original community policing. That is where the community as a group has an impact on that individual student or child. And so in order to do those types of things, we have to have good working relationships with schools, with the community, with businesses, and the ability to sit down and say, Tracy's having problems, and one of the issues may be larger than a law enforcement and a school issue, may be unemployment. So, where do we get those part-time jobs? Well, if we know business leaders who need some help sweeping up or cleaning up, then we may connect those two together.
And who does that connection?
Well, to me, it doesn't matter who does the connection. I might have it on the police side, or I might go to the school and say, do you have it?
And we're
I think, but
deliberately
you do it, right?
establishing that.
But that really takes a conscientious effort. It
Yeah,
means that all sides really have to think
It
about
takes a
it.
conscientious effort, and it takes actual investment.
Absolutely.
And so
Investment of time or money?
money. And
And
so
time.
the welcoming and reconnection centers we set up across LA so that students who are either struggling outside of school, either struggling with law enforcement, struggling with issues such as just non-documentation, struggling with, poverty. 87% of our youth live in circumstances of poverty, and most of it pretty unimaginable. And the consequences of generational and endemic poverty are way beyond the school. But it doesn't mean it's not beyond us trying to intervene.
And the police.
That
clearly.
is
I mean, you
correct.
think about, kids who don't eat.
Correct.
It's something as simple as having breakfast in the morning
Right.
to make sure that they go that. And whether, the schools do an excellent job of doing it, or whether or not, we have police volunteers that come in and help feed that.
So much of this isn't rocket science, but why is it so difficult to affect what seems like common sense change? How do you explain the reaction still that's there that says,
I think we live in a pretty fearful society. And we live in a strikingly fearful society about young people. And we've had some examples which would give us pause and reason to be fearful. And Columbine is an example, and we could list those other examples. But for a long time, there's just a fundamental distrust of people who don't look like us, don't speak like us, and we make kind of gigantic, sweeping generalizations about youth that require the investment of the other kind of investment, which is time to talk, time to understand bias, time to surface a whole bunch of assumptions about students and have them participating in this conversation. And you know what? We're short on that kind of time in public education, but it's incredibly important. I think the most potent conversations are ones when students are side by side with adults.
Absolutely. And I have to add to that, too, there's money to be made in crime. So you look at the prison industrial complex, you look at private prisons, I mean, you look at all of those things. So, I mean, I think that when you're talking about eradicating, eventually this sort of industry as opposed to doing community-based initiatives, which are far more effective and cheaper, you have people that are going to push back.
but there's another more difficult side to it, which is a political dimension, which none of you have mentioned yet. And if you don't have the politics right, then nothing's going to happen. And so far, the politics in a lot of cities or states hasn't been on that same wavelength.
That's where the
It's-
community is involved. You vote.
Yes.
I mean, that's where the community organizing comes into play. Again, you put politicians in their offices, and a lot of that is about exercising that right to vote and to vote those out that don't really agree with the best way to treat our children.
And they're not on the
mean,
same
I-
wavelength in LA right now.
I mean, as a school board, I want to give huge credit because no one ran on these issues and they were resolute and uniform on these issues. And it is risky when you're out there being first around this kind of work. I mean, so that is very, very true. But I also want to give a giant shout out to the community-based organizations who put it up straight up in your face, that this is not okay, and that we will organize student voice. I mean, the Student Climate Bill of Rights emerged from students in probably the best and most powerful use of protest and student voice I think I've ever seen. It's when an organization's leadership and when an organization's policy leadership and the board will decide, let's figure this out versus let's find ways to stop this, then I think you begin to have things happen at scale.
Absolutely.
That's very optimistic.
I don't think on this issue, this is insolvable. It's not. We actually know, we can see results. This is more about public acts of professional courage than this is about an intractable problem with no solutions.
You think it's possible to happen on the part of the police as well, that they can?
Oh, absolutely. And you see that happening now. I mean, you talk about Ferguson and what's happening there and the community mobilizing and demanding better service and demanding the fact that, you know, our tax-paying dollars are going to people that we trust, and right now you don't have our trust. So absolutely, you're going to see the exact same thing happening in policing.
A lot of it is just simply talking, just dialogue like we're having today.
Right, but it's a difficult dialogue when you
Very difficult.
interject the issue of race.
Yes.
I mean, it's a very difficult dialogue, and you have to have space for that and patience for that. A lot of folks want things to change yesterday, and you have to have a space where people are comfortable with having that conversation. And at first it's uncomfortable, but eventually it does get there.
But
I'll
it's
give you
not,
an example. You start a dialogue with this, and the first thing it says, I really want you to understand I'm not a racist. So when that has to be announced at the beginning of a dialogue,
so I'm
that's
not a racist, but
probably good barometer. We have an issue. I mean, so
yeah.
give space for that to actually
Absolutely.
have true and authentic airtime. The other thing is dialogue. A month doesn't go by where I do not spend time with the chief of police in LA. I mean, we have a remarkably good relationship, and that takes energy, deliberate, and effort all the time to do that. If we just think it's going to happen, we're actually all way too busy and all very much consumed with the problems. So finding a way so that institutions actually build relationship across them, that matters enormously too.
Meaningful relationship.
Yeah,
I want to thank you both.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for raising really important, very important topics.
Absolutely.
On our last show, Incarceration Nation, we asked how America became the world's biggest jailer. One answer is that the path to prison often starts at a young age, when a troubled young person is shunted by schools and juvenile courts into a pipeline that ends inevitably in the adult system. If you're poor, uneducated, and come from a community of color, escaping from that pipeline seems almost impossible. So it's worth asking, is the aim of our juvenile justice system to help such young people change their lives before it's too late, or just to punish them? I'm Steve Handelman. Thanks for watching. See you next time.